They laughed when he married a fat girl, ridiculing his choice and tearing down her worth. For years, they mocked her appearance. But 3 years later, the tables have turned, and now they're the ones begging for mercy. What could possibly have happened to leave them begging for mercy? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Jason Mallory stared at the pile of unpaid bills spread across his scratched desk, each one a reminder of his dwindling bank account. The leather of his worn office chair creaked as he leaned back, running his fingers through his messy brown hair. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty blinds of his small home office. "If this pitch doesn't work, it's over," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the muffled sound of city traffic outside his window. A horn honked in the distance, and the rumble of buses and cars created a constant backdrop that only made his isolation feel more profound. He picked up one of the bills, another late notice from his internet provider. The red stamp across it made his stomach twist. 3 years of pursuing his dream of creating an innovative coding education platform had left him with more debt than success. The wall clock's steady ticking seemed to mock his situation, counting down the moments until he'd have to admit defeat. Later that evening, Jason adjusted his navy blue tie in the mirror of his apartment's tiny bathroom. The community networking event at the downtown convention center wasn't exactly where he wanted to be on a Thursday night, but he needed connections, and maybe a miracle. His reflection showed dark circles under his eyes, but he straightened his shoulders and practiced his smile. It looked forced, but it would have to do. The convention center lobby buzzed with activity. Men and women in expensive suits moved through the space with the easy confidence that came from success. Jason clutched his worn leather briefcase closer, suddenly conscious of its peeling edges. Near the refreshment table, a group of young entrepreneurs huddled together, their laughter carrying across the room. Jason drifted closer, hoping to join their conversation. "So I told him, why settle for 6 figures when we could aim for 7? A man in a perfectly tailored suit grinned, swirling his drink. "The deal closed last week." The others nodded appreciatively, sharing their own success stories. Each casual mention of million-dollar investments and successful exits made Jason's modest pitch feel increasingly inadequate. "What am I even doing here?" he whispered to himself, stepping away from the group. His innovative ideas about making coding education accessible suddenly seemed naive in this room full of profit-focused executives. He wandered toward the main presentation area, where a speaker was finishing his talk about aggressive growth strategies. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, filled with attendees taking notes on tablets and laptops that cost more than Jason's monthly rent. That's when he noticed her. In the third row, a woman with striking presence raised her hand. The speaker acknowledged her, and she stood, her voice clear and commanding. "Your strategy assumes unlimited capital and no market resistance," she said, her tone professional but challenging. "But what about companies that prioritize sustainable growth and social impact? Shouldn't we be discussing models that balance profit with purpose?" The room fell silent. The speaker seemed taken aback, fumbling for a response. But the woman wasn't finished. She continued to break down the flaws in his argument, her analysis sharp and insightful. Jason found himself moving closer, drawn by her magnetic presence. Her dark blazer was simple but elegant, and her posture radiated confidence. But it was more than that. Her words resonated with everything he believed about business and purpose. Without realizing it, he had made his way to the aisle nearest her row. He could see her profile now, the determination in her expression as she articulated her points. Other attendees were nodding along, some taking notes. She had transformed the entire room's energy with just a few well-chosen questions. Intrigued, Jason stepped closer, hoping to hear more of her perspective. Alice Thornton sat poised at the networking event, her notebook balanced perfectly on her lap as her pen moved across the page with purpose. Her curly brown hair frames her face, and her plus-sized figure is elegant in a fitted navy dress. The fitted navy dress she wore accentuated her curves with confidence, making a statement that she belonged in this space of entrepreneurs and innovators. From across the room, Jason watched as she raised her hand again, her green eyes focused intently on the speaker. "You mentioned disrupting the market," she said, her voice clear and steady. But your strategy seems to rely on traditional metrics. How do you plan to actually create meaningful change? The speaker stumbled through a vague response about market dynamics and synergy. Alice's pen remained still, and she gave a slight shake of her head. Jason couldn't help but smile at her obvious dismissal of the empty corporate speak. Taking a deep breath, Jason worked up the courage to approach her as other attendees began moving toward the refreshment table. His heart pounded as he drew closer, noticing how her presence seemed both welcoming and intimidating at the same time. "You seem to know what you're talking about," he said, immediately wishing he'd thought of a more clever opening line. But Alice's face lit up with a genuine smile, her green eyes sparkling with interest. "I like asking the hard questions," she replied, closing her notebook. "Someone has to cut through all the fluff." Her voice carried a warmth that put Jason at ease despite his nerves. They fell into an easy conversation about the tech market, with Alice pointing out opportunities that others seemed to overlook. "Everyone's chasing the same demographic," she explained, gesturing expressively. "But there's this huge untapped market of users who feel ignored by current solutions." Jason felt electricity course through him as ideas began forming. Each point Alice made connected with thoughts he'd had, but hadn't been able to articulate. "That's exactly what I've been trying to figure out," he said eagerly. "The current apps are so focused on surface-level solutions." As the event wound down, Jason gathered his things, still buzzing from their conversation. But as he headed toward the exit, he caught snippets of whispered conversations and stifled laughter from a group of attendees. Their eyes were fixed on Alice as she packed up her belongings. "Can you believe she had the nerve to challenge every speaker?" one woman whispered behind her hand. "Well, you know how some people need to compensate," a man replied with a smirk, his eyes clearly judging Alice's size. Jason's fists clenched at his sides, anger rising in his chest. He watched as Alice walked past the group, her head held high, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes that betrayed she'd heard every word. The urge to say something, to defend her, burned in his throat, but uncertainty held him back. He stood frozen, wrestling with his desire to speak up and his fear of making the situation worse. The group's quiet laughter echoed in the hallway, and Jason's nails dug into his palms as he watched Alice disappear around the corner, her steps never faltering despite the cruel comments that followed her. The morning sun streamed through the cafe's large windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden tables and creating dancing patterns on the walls. Alice sat across from Jason, her bright blue scarf adding a pop of color to her gray sweater. The bustling atmosphere of the cafe filled the air with the gentle hum of conversation and the rich aroma of fresh coffee. "So the main issue," Alice explained, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke, "is that these small businesses are trying to compete using outdated methods. They're drowning in a digital world they don't understand." She paused to take a sip of her chai latte, her green eyes bright with passion. Jason leaned forward, his coffee forgotten as he absorbed every word. The morning crowd moved around them, but he remained focused solely on Alice's explanation. "Most tech solutions overwhelm them," she continued, pulling out her tablet to show him some graphs. "Look at these statistics. 80% of small businesses feel left behind by current technology. But it's not because they don't want to adapt, it's because nobody's meeting them where they are." Jason nodded eagerly, recognition flooding his features. "That's exactly the problem I've been trying to solve with CodeSpark. We have the framework, but we've been missing this perspective." He set his coffee down and met her gaze directly. "You're exactly what CodeSpark needs." Alice's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, and she fiddled with the end of her scarf. Her voice softened, carrying a note of hesitation that hadn't been there before. "People don't always take me seriously, Jason. Are you sure?" The question hung between them, weighted with past experiences and unspoken doubts. Jason didn't hesitate. "I see what they don't. You're brilliant." His voice carried absolute conviction. "In one conversation, you've identified problems that my team has missed for months. You understand both the technical and human sides of this issue." A slight blush colored Alice's cheeks, but she sat up straighter, squaring her shoulders. I've spent years studying market patterns and user behavior, she admitted. I know there's a better way to bridge this gap. Then help me build that bridge, Jason said, his eyes lighting up with possibility. Join CodeSpark as our strategic development director. We can create something that actually makes a difference. Alice looked down at her half-empty cup, then back at Jason's earnest face. A small smile tugged at her lips as she nodded. Okay, she said softly. Yes, let's do this. Her heart felt cautiously hopeful, like a bird testing its wings before flight. Jason gathered his things, his movements energized by their discussion. As he stood to leave, his entire demeanor radiated a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of unpaid bills and uncertainty that had haunted him just days ago seemed lighter now, transformed by the possibility of what lay ahead. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jason's office as Mark Delaney strutted in, his designer suit perfectly pressed, and his smile sharp as a knife. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor with each deliberate step. He leaned against Jason's desk, disturbing a neat stack of papers, and crossed his arms with an air of casual superiority. So, the big girl is your big idea? Mark's smirk widened as he watched Jason organizing presentation materials for tomorrow's meeting. His tone dripped with mockery, each word carefully chosen to wound, like a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Jason's jaw tightened and he set down the papers with controlled precision, fighting the urge to snap back. She's brilliant. That's what matters. His voice was firm, but something in his chest constricted at Mark's dismissive attitude, a familiar ache of disappointment in his old friend. Mark threw his head back and laughed, the sound echoing off the office walls like breaking glass. Come on, buddy. Be realistic here. You'll never get investors to take you seriously with someone like her. He shook his head as if explaining something obvious to a child, his perfectly styled hair not moving an inch. Image matters in this business. You know that. It's all about first impressions. Alice knows more about market strategy than anyone I've met, Jason countered, but Mark's words had planted a tiny seed of doubt. He thought about the upcoming investor meetings, the critical eyes that would be watching them, judging every detail. In the main conference room, Alice stood at the whiteboard, explaining her latest analysis to the team. Her marker moved confidently across the surface, mapping out growth projections and market opportunities with practiced precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she worked, but she couldn't miss the whispers behind her, the subtle glances exchanged between some team members. Did you see what she's wearing? How does she expect clients to respect us? Jason must be desperate. The words floated across the room like poison darts, each one finding its mark. Alice's stomach knotted, but her hand remained steady as she drew another graph, the lines crisp and perfect. She'd learned long ago to keep her voice level, her face composed even when her insides churned with hurt and anger. Years of practice had taught her that showing weakness only gave them more ammunition. Later that afternoon, Jason found Alice in the break room. She stood by the window, her shoulders slumped as she stirred her tea absently, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. The usual confidence in her posture had dimmed, replaced by a weariness he hadn't seen before. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold beyond the glass. "Ignore them," he said gently, moving to stand beside her. The afternoon light softened her features, highlighting the quiet strength in her expression, the determination that drew him to her from the start. Alice straightened up, a faint smile touching her lips as she adjusted her glasses. "I'm used to it, but thank you." Her voice carried years of practice at brushing off cruel comments, of standing tall when others tried to make her feel small. The tea in her cup had grown cold, forgotten in her contemplation. The neon sign of Pete's Diner cast a warm, pink glow through the window where Jason and Alice sat in their usual booth. Their coffee cups steamed between them, and the familiar sounds of clinking plates and quiet conversations created a cozy backdrop. They had just landed their biggest client yet, and the victory felt sweeter because they'd achieved it together. Alice's curly hair was slightly disheveled from their long day, but her eyes sparkled with energy as she sketched rapid figures on a paper napkin. "If we implement this strategy for the Morrison account," she explained, her pen moving quickly, "we could double their engagement within 3 months." Jason barely heard her words. His heart hammered against his ribs as he fidgeted with his fork, turning it over and over in his fingers. The weight of the small velvet box in his jacket pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. He watched Alice work, admiring the way she poured herself into everything she did, the passion that radiated from her very being. "Alice," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the gentle hum of the diner. She looked up from her napkin, her green eyes curious. A strand of hair fell across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear. "What is it?" Jason's hands trembled slightly, but he kept his gaze steady on her face. "You're not just my partner in business. You're my partner in everything. You make me better, stronger, happier." His fingers found the box in his pocket, and he placed it carefully on the table between them. "Will you marry me, Alice? Will you make me the happiest man alive?" Alice's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as they fixed on the small velvet box. Tears gathered in her eyes, making them shine in the diner's warm light. "Jason, are you sure?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion. "People don't always see me for who I am. They judge." Jason reached across the table and took her free hand in his. His touch was gentle but firm, his fingers warm against her skin. "I've never been more sure about anything. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about us." Alice's tears spilled over as she nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Yes." Jason's smile lit up his entire face as he took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. They sat there, hand in hand, the world outside fading away, sharing a quiet moment of pure happiness. The garden was a picture of spring perfection. White roses and lilies lined the aisle, their delicate petals dancing in the gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of fresh flowers through the air. Sunlight filtered through the cherry blossoms overhead, creating a natural cathedral of soft pink and white, casting dappled shadows that moved like lace across the emerald grass. Jason stood at the altar, his heart racing with anticipation, his dark suit crisp and neat against the pastoral backdrop. His hands fidgeted with his boutonniere as he watched the guests settling into their seats. The string quartet began playing the wedding march, their bows moving in perfect synchronization as the rich melody filled the garden, and the assembled guests rose to their feet. But amid the rustle of formal wear and the sweet melody of violins, harsh whispers cut through the air like paper cuts, disrupting the sacred atmosphere. "He could have done better," Lauren's voice carried from several rows back, where she sat in her designer dress, her perfectly manicured hand covering her mouth as she leaned toward another guest, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight. Jason's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles turning white beneath his tanned skin. He forced himself to take a deep breath, drawing in the fragrant spring air, focusing instead on the pathway where his bride would appear. And then she did. Alice emerged like a vision in white lace, her curvy figure beautifully draped in a gown that seemed made of moonlight and dreams. The dress hugged her curves perfectly, flowing out into a modest train that whispered across the grass, catching bits of sunlight like morning dew. Her face glowed with happiness behind her veil, and her bouquet of white and pink roses trembled slightly in her hands, decorated with ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Jason felt tears prick at his eyes. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and his heart swelled with love and pride. The ceremony passed in a blur of joy and promise, filled with meaningful glances and tender words, and soon the reception was in full swing under a massive white tent. Fairy lights twinkled overhead like stars, casting a warm golden glow over everything, and the dance floor filled with laughing guests moving to the upbeat music. But even here, in this moment of celebration, darkness tried to creep in like an unwelcome shadow. Lauren's voice carried across the refreshment table, her wine glass tilting dangerously as she gestured with exaggerated movements. "I give it a year," she announced to her small circle of listeners, her laugh sharp and cruel like breaking glass. I mean, really, what could he possibly see in her? She's not exactly his usual type. Jason, who had been making his way to get Alice a glass of champagne, stopped dead in his tracks, the crystal flutes in his hands catching the light. The muscles in his jaw worked as he turned to face his cousin, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "If you can't respect my wife," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of years of built-up frustration, "you can leave." Lauren's perfectly painted lips parted in surprise, her cheeks flushing red against her pale complexion. Nearby guests fell silent, watching the exchange with uncomfortable attention, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Alice, who stood just a few feet away talking to Jason's mother, pretended not to hear, though her shoulders tensed slightly. But Jason saw the way her smile faltered slightly, the brief flash of hurt in her eyes before she covered it with grace and continued her conversation, her voice steady and warm. When the DJ announced it was time for the couple's first dance, Jason took Alice's hand and led her to the center of the dance floor. The opening notes of their chosen song filled the air as he pulled her close, breathing in the subtle scent of her perfume. Her lace-covered hand felt small and warm in his as they began to sway to the music, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. "You're perfect," he whispered, his lips close to her ear, his breath stirring loose strands of her carefully styled hair. The fairy lights overhead caught the diamonds in her ring, sending tiny rainbows across her white dress like scattered promises. Alice's eyes met his, filled with love, gratitude, and determination, a single happy tear trailing down her cheek. In that moment, as they moved together to the music, the rest of the world faded away. The whispers, the judgment, all of it disappeared in the warm circle of their embrace, leaving only their love and the promise of their future together. 3 years later, Jason and Alice sit in a high-rise office overlooking Manhattan. The Manhattan skyline stretched out before them like a concrete and glass masterpiece, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. Alice sat behind her mahogany desk in the corner office of CodeSpark's headquarters, her fingers trailing over the sleek surface as she took in the view. The office exuded success, from the modern art on the walls to the state-of-the-art technology seamlessly integrated into every corner. The gentle hum of the city below filtered through the triple-paned windows, creating a soothing backdrop to their sanctuary of achievement. Jason walked over to his desk, carefully placing their wedding photo next to his computer monitor. The silver frame caught the sunlight, making the image of their first dance sparkle. "Look how far we've come," he said with a smile, his eyes filled with pride and love. The memory of that perfect day still brought warmth to his heart, just as fresh as when they'd first said their vows. Alice's navy blazer fit perfectly across her shoulders as she straightened in her chair, emanating the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. The past 3 years had transformed CodeSpark from a struggling startup into a powerhouse of business innovation. Their revolutionary approach had saved countless companies from bankruptcy, earning them respect throughout the industry. Every success story added another layer to their growing reputation for excellence. Their assistant, Sarah, knocked softly before entering with a stack of papers in her hands. "Here's today's list of consultation requests," she said, placing them on Alice's desk. "Some interesting names came in this morning." Her knowing smile suggested she was well aware of the significance of some of the applicants. Alice picked up the list, her green eyes scanning the document. A small smirk played across her lips as she reached 2 particular names. "Lauren Delaney, Mark Delaney," she read aloud, looking up at Jason. Ironic, isn't it? The names brought back a flood of memories from their early days, when every small victory had been hard-won. Jason moved closer to her desk, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. He remembered all too well the cutting remarks, the whispered jokes, the barely concealed contempt. "They mocked us, and now they're begging for help," he said, shaking his head at the twist of fate. His hand found its way to Alice's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity they'd perfected over the years. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city buzzed with energy, a testament to the endless possibilities that lay before them. The same city that had once seemed so intimidating now felt like their kingdom. Streams of sunlight painted golden patterns across the polished floor, highlighting the space they'd worked so hard to earn. Alice leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers interlaced in her lap. Her wedding ring caught the light, a constant reminder of their journey together. "Let's see how humble they can be," she said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had carried them through every challenge. The afternoon light cast a warm glow across her face, illuminating the subtle smile that spoke of hard-won wisdom and well-deserved success. The aroma of homemade pasta and fresh garlic filled their cozy Manhattan apartment as Alice and Jason sat down for their evening meal. Soft jazz, one of Miles Davis's gentler pieces, played in the background, and the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars through their floor-to-ceiling windows. Alice had prepared her signature carbonara, complete with perfectly crispy pancetta, but her mind seemed elsewhere as she picked at her food, her fork making quiet scraping sounds against the ceramic plate. After a few moments of comfortable silence, broken only by the clink of silverware, she reached beside her chair and pulled out a sleek black folder. With deliberate movements, she slid it across the wooden table to Jason, her fingers lingering for just a moment on its smooth surface. "I've been investing in their companies," she said, her voice calm and measured, steady as a surgeon's hand. Jason's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. A piece of pasta dangled forgotten from his utensil. "Why?" he asked, setting down his fork and reaching for the folder with obvious curiosity. Inside, he found detailed financial reports showing significant investments in both Lauren and Mark's struggling businesses, each page meticulously organized and annotated. The warm light from their modern pendant lamp cast a gentle glow on Alice's face as she sat back in her chair, the leather cushion creaking softly. Her green eyes held a mixture of satisfaction and determination, like a chess master who had just executed a brilliant play. "Because I knew they'd fail," she explained, her voice steady and clear as mountain air. "They underestimated me, Jason, and it's poetic justice. Sometimes the best revenge is simply watching people trip over their own feet." Jason flipped through the papers, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding like clouds parting after a storm. The documents revealed a careful, calculated strategy. Alice had been quietly buying shares in their competitors' companies for months, watching as poor management decisions and outdated business models slowly drove them into the ground. Each investment had been timed perfectly, like a dance choreographed to the rhythm of their rivals' mistakes. A smile spread across Jason's face as he looked at his wife with growing admiration, his eyes crinkling at the corners. This was the brilliant strategist he'd fallen in love with, the woman who could see 10 moves ahead while others were still figuring out their first step. The same people who had laughed at her, dismissed her, and undervalued her had never seen this coming, too blinded by their own prejudices to recognize the shark swimming in their waters. The city hummed below them as they sat in their dining room, the weight of this revelation settling between them like a comfortable blanket. Alice's hand rested on the table, her wedding ring catching the light as she reached for her wine glass, the deep red liquid swirling gently. She took a small sip before setting it down with precision, not a drop out of place. "Now," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark in boardrooms across the city. "We decide their fate." Her words hung in the air like smoke, full of possibility and promise. The sleek conference room on the 35th floor felt smaller than usual, as Lauren and Mark Delaney sat across the polished mahogany table from Alice and Jason. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the beads of sweat on Mark's forehead and the slight tremor in Lauren's manicured hands as she clutched her designer purse. The city sprawled out behind them, a testament to the heights from which they had fallen. "We need your help," Lauren began, her voice trembling. The words seemed to physically pain her as they left her lips. Her usual confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by a desperate vulnerability that made her look smaller in her expensive suit. The Cartier bracelet on her wrist, once worn like armor, now seemed to weigh her down. Mark nodded beside her, his face ashen. "Our companies, they're failing. We've lost major contracts, and our investors are pulling out." His voice cracked slightly as he added, "We didn't know where else to turn." His fingers drummed nervously against the table's surface, a habit he'd always criticized in others. Alice sat perfectly still, her posture straight and professional in her navy blazer. Her expression remained carefully neutral as she listened to their pleas. The same people who had once whispered cruel jokes about her were now sitting before her, their fates in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she felt no satisfaction in their downfall. "Public apologies," Alice said finally, her voice clear and steady. "Both of you will need to make formal statements acknowledging your past behavior and commitment to change." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You'll also implement comprehensive diversity programs in your companies." Her hands were folded neatly on the table, steady and sure. Lauren's lips parted in surprise, but Alice continued before she could speak. "And complete transparency. We'll need full access to your books, your decisions, everything." Her green eyes fixed on them with unwavering intensity. No exceptions. The authority in her voice left no room for negotiation. The room fell silent, the distant hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Jason leaned forward slightly, his presence supportive but firm. "Do you agree?" he added, his tone making it clear this wasn't a negotiation. The morning light cast long shadows across the table between them. Lauren was the first to nod, her perfectly styled hair falling slightly forward. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and said more firmly, "Yes, we agree." Her designer perfume, usually so overwhelming, seemed faint now, as if even it had lost its confidence. Mark followed suit, his usual smugness replaced by genuine humility. "Whatever you need," he said quietly. One by one, the other executives at the table nodded their agreement, their expressions a mixture of relief and shame. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them. As the group filed out of the conference room, their shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of both defeat and acceptance. Jason reached over and squeezed Alice's hand. Her skin was warm against his, and he could feel the strength in her grip. "You were incredible," he said softly, pride evident in his gentle smile. Alice turned to him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "This is just the beginning," she replied, her voice filled with quiet determination. The morning sun caught the highlights in her hair, creating a subtle halo effect that seemed to underscore the moment's significance. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated Alice's home office as her fingers flew across the keyboard, casting warm shadows on the walls. The gentle tapping of keys filled the room while Jason sat beside her, occasionally leaning in to read over her shoulder, his presence both supportive and calming. The terms she was drafting were comprehensive and strict, leaving no room for loopholes or half measures, each clause carefully crafted to ensure real change. "They'll hate this," Jason said, running a hand through his dark hair as he read the section about mandatory sensitivity training for all executive staff. His eyes widened at the detailed requirements and substantial penalties for non-compliance. Alice's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "Good, they need to feel it." Her voice carried no malice, just calm determination. She adjusted her reading glasses and continued typing, adding detailed requirements for quarterly diversity reports and external audits, her fingers never hesitating as she outlined the consequences. The next morning, the conference room buzzed with nervous energy as Alice stood at the head of the table, her tablet in hand, radiating quiet confidence. Lauren sat rigid in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails drumming anxiously against her water glass, her usual poise noticeably strained. The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs as Alice began her presentation, the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "First," Alice said, her voice clear and professional, "you'll each make public apologies addressing your past discriminatory behavior. These will be posted on all your company platforms and social media accounts." She swiped to the next slide, her movements deliberate and assured. "Second, you'll establish and fund a diversity initiative focused on supporting underrepresented groups in tech, with a minimum annual budget of $5 million. Mark's face reddened as Alice continued, his complexion nearly matching his silk tie. "Third, you'll implement inclusive hiring practices with quarterly reviews, and public reporting of your diversity metrics. The data will be independently verified and published without editing. Lauren's composure finally cracked. "You're being unreasonable," she stammered, her voice rising with indignation, her designer bracelet jangling as she gestured wildly. "This will cost us millions. Our shareholders will—" "Unreasonable?" Alice cut her off, her tone dropping several degrees, the temperature in the room seeming to fall with it. "Like mocking me at my own wedding?" The room fell silent as Lauren's face paled, the memory clearly striking home. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to discuss how you tried to convince Jason he was making a mistake by marrying me. Should we review those text messages?" Lauren's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, her usual sharp tongue failing her. The other executives stared at their hands or shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "These terms are non-negotiable," Alice continued, her voice steady as steel. "You came to us for help. This is the price. Take it or watch your company continue its downward spiral." One by one, the executives nodded their agreement, some more reluctantly than others, their pride visibly wounded. Lauren's shoulders slumped in defeat as she whispered, "Fine, we'll do it," her voice barely audible in the hushed room. Jason watched from his seat, his chest swelling with pride at Alice's commanding presence. He leaned closer to her and whispered, "You've just shown them who's in control," his eyes gleaming with admiration for his wife's strength and grace under pressure. Mark burst into Jason's office, his face red with anger, tie askew and suit jacket rumpled from his agitated movements. The door slammed against the wall with such force that the framed certificates rattled, one threatening to fall. "You can't seriously expect us to humiliate ourselves like this," he shouted, throwing a stack of papers onto Jason's desk, sending several other documents fluttering to the floor. Jason rose slowly from his chair, his expression calm but determined, shoulders squared with quiet confidence. The morning light streaming through the window cast shadows across his face as he stood his ground, hands planted firmly on his desk. "You brought this on yourselves, Mark," he said evenly, maintaining eye contact with his former friend, who seemed to shrink slightly under his steady gaze. "This is extortion," Mark's voice cracked with desperation, his hands trembling as he gestured wildly at the scattered papers. "Public apologies, mandatory training? Do you know what this will do to our reputation? Our clients will abandon us." "Your reputation?" Jason's laugh was hollow, tinged with years of pent-up disappointment. "The same reputation you built by stepping on others? By mocking people who didn't fit your narrow view of success? Maybe it's time for a change." In her own office down the hall, Alice sat at her desk, methodically sorting through her emails, her perfectly organized workspace, a stark contrast to the chaos erupting nearby. Her inbox pinged with yet another message from Lauren. The subject line read, "Urgent, please reconsider terms." Alice's finger hovered over the delete button before clicking it without hesitation, her lips pressed into a thin line. This was the 5th email today, each one more desperate than the last. Lauren's attempts at negotiation had grown increasingly frantic, each message more revealing than the last. "We could double the diversity funding. Perhaps a private apology instead. Please, Alice, be reasonable." But Alice remained unmoved, her resolve strengthened by years of enduring their cruelty. She remembered every snide comment, every whispered joke, every sideways glance at corporate events. Her wedding day flashed through her mind, the day that should have been purely joyful, tainted by their cruel words and judgmental stares, the memory still sharp and painful. The sound of Mark's raised voice carried through the walls, echoing down the hallway. Alice could hear the desperation in his tone, the anger of a man unused to being powerless. She smiled slightly, a small satisfaction warming her chest as she continued with her work as if the commotion didn't exist, her fingers steady on her keyboard. Later that afternoon, Jason found Alice in the break room, pouring herself a cup of tea, the gentle aroma of chamomile filling the air. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, highlighting the determination in her face and the quiet strength in her posture. He leaned against the counter, watching her with admiration, his tie loosened after the morning's confrontation. Some people will never change until they're forced to, he said softly, his voice carrying both wisdom and resignation, his eyes reflecting understanding of the difficult path ahead. Alice stirred her tea slowly, considering his words, the soft clink of her spoon against china filling the peaceful silence between them. Her wedding ring caught the light as she lifted her gaze to meet his, a symbol of their unshakable partnership. "Then we'll force them," she responded, her voice steady and certain, carrying the weight of justice long delayed but finally within reach. The grand ballroom of the Manhattan Tech Summit buzzed with anticipation. Hundreds of faces turned toward the stage as Alice Thornton stepped up to the microphone. Her navy blazer caught the spotlight, and her confident smile reached her eyes as she surveyed the crowd. 10 years ago, I sat where you're sitting," Alice began, her voice steady and clear. "But unlike many of you, I spent most of that time being told I didn't belong." She paused, letting her words sink in. "People judged me based on my appearance, not my abilities. They whispered behind my back, made jokes at my expense, and tried to push me out." In the front row, Jason beamed with pride. He watched as his wife commanded the attention of every person in the room, her presence magnetic and unwavering. "But here's what they didn't understand," Alice continued, gesturing with purpose. "Respect isn't optional. It's not something you earn by fitting into someone else's mold. It's a basic human right." Phones lifted throughout the audience, recording her words. Social media feeds began lighting up instantly, sharing clips of her speech. "Today, CodeSpark stands as proof that success doesn't look like what you might expect," Alice said, her voice growing stronger. "We've helped countless businesses transform their cultures, not just their bottom lines. And yes, some of those businesses once turned their backs on me." The panel moderator leaned forward, clearly captivated. Other panelists nodded in agreement as Alice spoke about implementing change and challenging old biases. Within hours, Dog Alice Inspires started trending on Twitter. Stories poured in from around the world, people sharing their own experiences of facing discrimination and pushing through barriers. "Your appearance doesn't define your worth," one viral tweet declared, sharing Alice's photo. "Thank you, Alice Thornton, for showing us that success has no size limit." More hashtags emerged: "Respect isn't optional" and "Jarn CodeSpark Revolution." Videos of Alice's speech racked up millions of views. Back in their hotel room that evening, Jason and Alice sat side by side on the plush sofa, scrolling through their phones. The movement they'd started was taking on a life of its own. "Look at this," Jason said softly, showing Alice a post from a young entrepreneur. "She says your story gave her the courage to pitch her idea to investors today." Alice's eyes welled up as she read comment after comment. Stories of resilience, determination, and triumph filled their screens. "It's bigger than us now," Jason said, squeezing her hand. The warmth of his touch grounded her as they watched their message spread across the globe. Alice nodded, her heart full. The quiet moment they shared contrasted beautifully with the digital storm they'd created. A storm of change, hope, and long overdue recognition. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Alice's corner office as she scrolled through her emails. Her fingers paused over the trackpad when she spotted a message with no sender name. The subject line made her breath catch. "The truth about your rise." Alice glanced around the empty office, suddenly aware of how quiet everything seemed. With slightly trembling hands, she clicked the email open. The message was brief but devastating. "They tried to destroy you. Your success wasn't just fought against, it was actively sabotaged. The whispers, the mockery, the resistance. It wasn't random. Someone orchestrated it all, pulling strings to ensure you'd fail. But you didn't. Now it's time you knew the truth." Alice read the message 3 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. She picked up her phone and pressed Jason's number on speed dial. "Can you come to my office?" Her voice was steady, but Jason knew her well enough to hear the tension underneath. Minutes later, Jason rushed in, his tie slightly askew. "What's wrong?" He moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Alice turned her monitor toward him. As Jason read, his face darkened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Who would do this?" he demanded, anger coloring his voice. "Who would deliberately try to hurt you?" "I don't know," Alice replied, her analytical mind already working through possibilities. "But we're going to find out." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a business card she'd been holding onto for just such an occasion. "Naomi Carter Investigations," she read aloud. "I met her at last month's business security conference. She specializes in corporate cases." Jason paced the office, his shoes making soft sounds against the carpet. "We need to know who was behind this, all those times we thought we were just dealing with regular prejudice." He shook his head, disgusted. Snap! Alice picked up her phone again and dialed the number on the card. After 2 rings, a crisp, professional voice answered. "Ms. Carter, this is Alice Thornton from Code Spark." Alice's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I need your help uncovering the truth about a potential conspiracy against my company." Jason watched as Alice scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. When she hung up, he moved closer to her desk. "Are you okay?" Alice took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'm not sure, but I will be. Whoever did this, they failed. We succeeded despite their best efforts." She looked up at her husband, determination replacing the shock in her eyes. Now it's time to make them answer for what they did. At 3 o'clock, Naomi Carter walked into CodeSpark's offices. She carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression was focused and alert. Alice and Jason led her into the conference room, where Alice forwarded her the anonymous email. Naomi read it carefully, taking notes in a small black notebook. "Someone wanted to make sure your journey was as difficult as possible," Naomi said, looking up from her notes. "They coordinated attacks on your reputation, probably influenced potential clients and investors." She tapped her pen against the notebook. "But they made mistakes, everyone does. We'll find them." Alice nodded, feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. Finally, the pieces were starting to make sense. The synchronized rejection from investors, the eerily similar criticisms, the well-timed obstacles that had appeared in their path. "How long will this take?" Jason asked, his hand finding Alice's under the table. "I'll start immediately," Naomi replied, already pulling out her laptop. "Give me 2 weeks to gather preliminary evidence. I'll need access to your email archives, meeting records, and any documentation from your early days." Naomi Carter sat across from Alice in the sleek conference room, her tablet displaying a neat array of documents and photographs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished table as she delivered her findings. "The smear campaign wasn't random," Naomi said, her professional demeanor masking the gravity of her discovery. "It was funded by someone close to you." She tapped her tablet, bringing up financial records that reflected a pattern of suspicious transactions. Alice's hands remained steady in her lap, though her heart raced beneath her composed exterior. Jason stood behind her chair, his presence solid and reassuring. "We traced a series of payments through shell companies," Naomi continued, sliding the tablet across the table. "All of them led back to one source." She pulled up a document that made Jason inhale sharply. "Lauren Delaney," Naomi stated flatly. "She orchestrated the whole thing. The whispers at industry events, the anonymous complaints to potential investors, even the negative press that mysteriously appeared right before major deals." Jason's fingers dug into the back of Alice's chair. "I trusted her," he muttered, his voice thick with betrayal. "She was at our wedding. She smiled at us, congratulated us, all while—" Alice reached up and placed her hand over Jason's, feeling the tension in his grip. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating moves and countermoves like the strategic chess player she'd always been. Naomi spread out several photographs showing Lauren meeting with various people, journalists, business rivals, even former employees. She used her connections expertly, Naomi explained. Each person only knew their small part of the plan, but together they created a web designed to destroy your reputation. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showed regular payments to key players. Emails revealed carefully crafted talking points designed to undermine Alice's credibility. Text messages exposed Lauren's satisfaction as each piece of her plan fell into place. "There's more," Naomi added, her expression grim. She wasn't working alone. We've identified several co-conspirators, including some current business associates. Alice absorbed each detail with remarkable composure, her green eyes sharp and focused. The same strength that had carried her through years of prejudice and mockery now steeled her against this betrayal. "What do you recommend as our next steps?" Alice asked, her voice steady and professional. Naomi outlined several options, from legal action to quiet settlements. But Alice's mind was already made up. She straightened in her chair, her presence filling the room despite her seated position. "We're not stopping until we expose everyone involved," Alice said, her voice steady but icy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with her words, and even Naomi looked impressed by her resolve. Jason squeezed her shoulder in silent support, his earlier anger transforming into determination. They had built their success together, weathered countless storms, and now faced this new challenge as one united force. Naomi spread the documents across the conference table, her methodical movements matching her precise explanation. "Both Lauren and Mark Delaney made substantial contributions to various shell companies," she said, pointing to highlighted transactions. "These companies then funded negative press, fake reviews, and coordinated social media attacks against CodeSpark, and Alice specifically." Jason's face reddened as he scanned the evidence. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up one of the papers. "They didn't just mock you, they tried to destroy us," he said, his voice tight with anger. The betrayal cut deep, especially considering their shared history. Alice sat quietly, absorbing every detail. Her calm exterior belied the storm brewing within. After a moment, she stood up. "Thank you, Naomi. I'll handle this personally." Later that afternoon, Alice walked into Lauren's office unannounced. Lauren looked up from her desk, her confident facade crumbling at the sight of Alice's determined expression. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, making the moment feel even more dramatic. "I have proof," Alice said simply, placing a folder on Lauren's desk. "Every payment, every planted story, every orchestrated attack." Lauren's hands shook as she opened the folder. Her face paled as she flipped through the pages. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Tears began forming in her eyes. "I didn't think you'd actually succeed," Lauren whispered, her voice breaking. "I was jealous. You had everything I wanted. Real success, respect, Jason's complete devotion." She wiped at her eyes, smearing her mascara. "I couldn't stand watching you prove everyone wrong." Alice stood tall, her presence commanding the room. Her voice was steady but cold as ice. "Your jealousy almost ruined me, but it didn't. Now, you'll face the consequences." She pulled out another document. "This details everything we're going to do. Legal action, public exposure, the works." Lauren shot up from her chair, panic evident in her expression. "Please, Alice, you can't. My reputation, my business, and I'll lose everything." She reached for Alice's arm. "I'm sorry, I truly am. Can't we work something out?" "Like you worked things out to destroy my reputation?" Alice asked, pulling her arm away. "Like you worked to sabotage my company? My marriage?" Lauren collapsed back into her chair, sobbing now. "Please forgive me," she begged. "I'll do anything. Please, Alice." Alice turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Lauren's pleas echoed behind her, but Alice didn't look back. She had spent years building herself up, refusing to let others' judgments define her. Now wasn't the time to waver. Jason sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of financial documents. His eyes were red from hours of scrutinizing transaction records, bank statements, and corporate filings. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the papers, highlighting patterns he hadn't noticed before. "Alice!" he called out, his voice urgent. "You need to see this." Alice walked in from her adjoining office, noting the intensity in Jason's expression. She moved to stand behind him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder as she leaned in to examine the documents he was pointing to. "It wasn't just Lauren," Jason said, spreading out several key papers. "There's a bigger player funding this. Look at these shell companies. The money trail leads back to multiple holding corporations, but they all connect to one source. Alice's eyes narrowed as she studied the complex web of transactions. These amounts are too large for Lauren or Mark to manage on their own, she agreed, tracing the flow of funds with her finger. Jason pulled up another document on his computer screen. Naomi found something interesting. These holding companies? They've been used before in similar situations. He clicked through several news articles, each describing failed startups that had shown initial promise. "Wait," Alice said, pointing to a familiar name that appeared in multiple stories. "Richard Carver? The tech mogul?" Jason nodded grimly. Every single one of these failed companies was led by women. And look at the pattern. Sudden PR crises, mysterious funding problems, coordinated social media attacks. Sound familiar? Alice's face hardened as she remembered the countless obstacles they'd faced. "He's known for being traditional," she said, her voice tight. "Old money, old views." "Traditional is putting it mildly," Jason scoffed, pulling up more articles. "Former employees have tried to speak out about his behavior, but they've all been silenced with settlements and NDAs. He's got a history of sabotaging startups led by women. He sees them as threats to his empire." Alice straightened up, her jaw set with determination. The pieces were falling into place, the coordinated attacks, the seemingly endless resources behind them, the systematic attempt to destroy not just their business, but her reputation. "Lauren and Mark were just pawns," she said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He probably approached them, knowing their jealousy would make them easy to manipulate." And Jason stood up, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "He's been doing this for years, Alice. Destroying careers, crushing dreams, all because he can't stand seeing women succeed in his industry." Alice looked at Jason, her green eyes blazing with resolve. The setting sun caught the determination in her expression as she said, "We expose him, and we end this." The weight of what they were about to undertake hung in the air between them. Richard Carver wasn't just any opponent. He was a titan of the industry, a man with unlimited resources and connections. But at that moment, looking at the evidence of his systematic destruction of women's careers, Alice knew they had no choice. Alice sat on the edge of her bed, shoulders slumped, her head cradled in her hands. The weight of everything they'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical burden. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of city life filtering through the windows. Jason noticed her absence from their home office and found her there. Without hesitation, he sat beside her, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. He wrapped a protective arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's okay to feel hurt," he said gently, his voice soft and understanding. Alice leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I tried so hard to be strong at our wedding, to pretend their whispers didn't matter." She closed her eyes, remembering Lauren's cruel laughter, the judgmental stares, the not-so-subtle comments. "I used that pain," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Every snide remark, every dismissive glance, I channeled it into determination. But," she paused, taking a shaky breath, "but it still hurts. It hurts so much, Jason. Standing there in my wedding dress on what should have been the happiest day of my life. Hearing them say you could do better." Jason tightened his hold on her, his jaw clenching at the memory. "They were wrong," he said firmly. "So incredibly wrong." "I know that now," Alice said, straightening up slightly. "And look at us. We've built something amazing. We've helped people, changed lives." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Every success has been like a quiet revenge against their doubts." "You've proven them all wrong," Jason agreed, his voice filled with pride. "Every single one of them. And now?" He turned to face her, his eyes intense with determination. "Now we finish this. We expose Carver and show the world exactly what we're capable of." Alice lifted her head, meeting his gaze. Years of partnership, love, and shared battles had forged an unbreakable bond between them. In his eyes, she saw not just support, but absolute faith in her abilities. She leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady and determined. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their downtown office, casting long shadows across the polished conference table. Alice sat at the head of the table, her tablet displaying folders of meticulously organized evidence. Jason paced slowly behind her, his reflection moving across the glass walls. "We have the evidence," Alice said, her voice steady and determined. She scrolled through document after document, each one a damning piece of proof against Richard Carver. "Now we make it public." Jason paused his pacing, resting his hands on the back of an empty chair. "The financial records alone are devastating," he noted, studying the spreadsheets displayed on the wall screen. "The pattern of targeting women-led startups is impossible to ignore." Alice nodded, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the table. "We'll release it in phases," she explained, pulling up a timeline she'd drafted. "First, we expose the pattern. Then, we reveal the paper trail linking him to Lauren and Mark. Finally, we show how deep the corruption goes." Running his fingers through his hair, Jason resumed his pacing. "This could get messy," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Carver has connections everywhere. He'll fight back hard." "It's worth it," Alice replied without hesitation. Her green eyes blazed with determination as she looked up at her husband. "Think about all the other women he's destroyed, the dreams he's crushed, the lives he's ruined." She stood up, smoothing her navy blazer. "Someone needs to stop him." Jason watched her, amazed as always by her strength. The morning light caught the highlights in her curly brown hair, and despite the serious moment, he couldn't help but smile at how beautiful she looked when she was fighting for what she believed in. "We'll need to protect our team," Alice continued, pulling up another document. "Legal's already prepared statements for everyone. HR is ready to handle any backlash. IT has reinforced our security protocols." "You've thought of everything," Jason said, pride evident in his voice. "I have to," she responded, her voice softening slightly. "We're not just fighting for us anymore. We're fighting for every person who's been told they don't belong, that they're not good enough, that they don't fit the right image." Jason walked over to where she stood, taking in her determined expression, the slight tension in her shoulders that only he would notice. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I trust you," he said simply, meaning every word. The 3 words carried the weight of their entire journey together, from that first meeting at the networking event, through their wedding day with its cruel whispers to this moment of truth. Alice squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from their connection. Alice sat in her home office, watching the stock ticker scroll across her monitor. Her fingers drummed steadily on her mahogany desk as Carver Industries' share price continued its steady decline. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on her face as a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "They didn't see this coming," she said with satisfaction, her voice carrying a quiet strength that had been years in the making. She picked up her phone and opened the investment app, where her substantial holdings in Carver's company were displayed. Over the past 6 months, she had quietly accumulated shares through various channels, building up enough leverage to make her move. Now, as she began systematically selling off large blocks of shares, the market was responding exactly as she'd predicted. Her phone buzzed with notifications from financial news outlets. Headlines flashed across her screen. Carver Industries faces investor exodus, tech giant stumbles amid controversy, whistleblower evidence rocks industry leader. In the kitchen, Jason prepared 2 cups of coffee, watching his wife work from afar. He could see the determined set of her shoulders, the focused expression that meant everything was falling into place. Walking into her office, he placed her favorite mug, the one with Boss Lady written in gold letters, beside her keyboard. The evidence they'd gathered was spreading like wildfire through the tech community. Emails exposed Carver's systematic campaign against female entrepreneurs. Financial records revealed the money trail leading back to Lauren and Mark. Each new revelation brought another wave of investors pulling out of Carver's company. Alice refreshed her browser, watching another news article appear. This one featured interviews with other women who'd been targeted by Carver's operation. Their stories matched Alice's own experience, creating a damning pattern that couldn't be ignored. "The board is calling for an emergency meeting," Alice said, scanning her emails. 3 major investors have already withdrawn their support. Her voice carried a hint of triumph, though her expression remained composed. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The weight of years of judgment, mockery, and sabotage seemed to lift from her shoulders with each passing hour. The same people who had dismissed her, who had tried to destroy her career, were now watching their carefully constructed world crumble. Jason came up behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "You've turned their arrogance into their downfall," he said softly, pride evident in his voice. The bright studio lights felt warm on Alice's face as she sat across from veteran news anchor Amelia Noah. The camera's red light blinked steadily, broadcasting live to millions of viewers across the country. Alice's navy blazer complemented her confident posture as she held up a thick folder of documents. "These records show a systematic campaign of discrimination and sabotage," Alice explained, her voice clear and unwavering. "Mr. Carver didn't just target me. His company has a history of undermining female-led startups through shell companies and coordinated smear campaigns." Amelia leaned forward, her expression grave. "And you have proof of all this?" "Every single detail," Alice replied, gesturing to the documents. "Bank transfers, email chains, recorded conversations. This isn't just about me or CodeSpark. It's about changing a system that allows powerful men like Richard Carver to crush dreams and talents simply because they don't fit his narrow worldview." The interview continued as Alice methodically laid out her evidence. Social media exploded with reactions. "There's Carver exposed" and "Alice Thornton speaks" began trending within minutes. Back at Carver Industries headquarters, chaos erupted. Phones rang constantly as investors demanded explanations. Emergency board meetings were called. The company's stock plummeted as shareholders rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Richard Carver's carefully crafted image as a tech visionary crumbled under the weight of evidence. Former employees began coming forward with their own stories, creating a devastating cascade of revelations. Major tech publications ran detailed exposés. "Tech giants fall from grace. The true cost of discrimination," read one headline. "Carver's House of Cards, a legacy of sabotage revealed," declared another. In their living room, Alice and Jason sat on their comfortable couch, watching the coverage unfold on their large flat-screen TV. The evening news showed footage of Carver being confronted by reporters outside his office building, his face ashen as he hurried to his waiting car. "Look at him run," Jason said, shaking his head. "Not so powerful now." Alice's tablet buzzed with notifications of more news coverage, but she set it aside. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for so long finally began to lift. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in months. "It's done," she said softly, leaning back against the couch cushions. The setting sun cast a warm glow through their windows, and for the first time in ages, she felt completely at peace. Jason squeezed her hand gently. On the TV, the news anchor continued reporting on the growing fallout from Alice's revelations, but to Alice, it all felt distant now. She had fought her battle, and she had won. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel buzzed with energy as journalists, tech industry leaders, and social activists packed the rows of chairs. Camera flashes sparkled like stars across the room, and the low hum of excited whispers filled the air. The CodeSpark logo gleamed on the backdrop behind the podium, where Alice and Jason stood side by side. Alice's emerald green dress caught the light as she leaned toward the microphone. Her voice carried clearly through the speakers, commanding attention from every corner of the room. "What started as a personal battle has grown into something much bigger," she said, her words measured and strong. "Today, we're announcing the launch of the CodeSpark Initiative for Inclusive Innovation. This program will provide funding and mentorship to entrepreneurs who have faced discrimination in the tech industry." The crowd listened intently as Alice outlined their plans. When she mentioned the first year's funding commitment of $10 million, Appreciative murmurs rippled through the audience. Her confidence seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone in the room. "We're not just changing policies," she continued. "We're changing minds. We're proving that success doesn't look like what some people think it should. It looks like determination. It looks like resilience. It looks like believing in yourself when others don't." The room erupted in applause, the sound swelling until it filled every corner. Some people stood, others cheered, and several journalists furiously typed on their laptops, capturing every word. Jason stepped forward then, his blue suit crisp and his smile warm as he took the microphone. His eyes found Alice's for a moment, filled with pride and love. "I want to say something important," he began, his voice carrying emotion that made the room grow quiet again. "Alice is the genius behind all of this. I'm proud to stand beside her." He turned to face her directly. "You saw possibilities where others saw problems. You turned obstacles into opportunities. You didn't just survive, you thrived, and you're helping others do the same." Alice felt tears prick at her eyes, but she held them back, her smile radiant as she looked at her husband. The applause started again, even louder than before. In the front row, she could see several young women wiping away tears of their own. Cameras flashed rapidly as Jason reached for Alice's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, a gesture they'd shared countless times before. Together, they stood at the podium, accepting the applause with gracious nods. They left the stage hand in hand, united and victorious. Their steps matched as they walked off, their shoulders straight, their heads held high. The conference room at CodeSpark headquarters was filled to capacity, with journalists and industry leaders packed shoulder to shoulder. Camera flashes created a strobe-like effect as Lauren Delaney approached the podium, her normally confident demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. Mark Delaney stood behind her, along with several other former critics, all looking equally uneasy under the harsh lights. Alice sat at the main table, her navy blazer crisp and professional, while Jason remained protectively by her side. Under the table, her hands trembled slightly, though her face remained composed, showing no hint of the emotional turmoil within. Lauren gripped the sides of the podium, her knuckles white. Her designer dress couldn't mask her nervousness as she cleared her throat and began to speak. She paused, swallowing hard. "I stand before you today to acknowledge my grievous mistakes." Her voice cracked slightly. "I mocked someone whose brilliance I couldn't comprehend. Alice Thornton, I'm sorry." The room fell silent as Lauren continued. "My jealousy and prejudice led me to judge someone based on appearance rather than ability. I was wrong, and my actions were inexcusable." Mark stepped forward next, his usual swagger replaced by genuine remorse. "I was wrong about Alice," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "She's a visionary. My narrow-mindedness and arrogance prevented me from seeing what was right in front of me." He looked directly at Alice. "I apologize for every dismissive comment, every cruel joke, and every attempt to undermine your success." One by one, other former critics approached the microphone. Each apology seemed to lift a weight from Alice's shoulders, though her hands continued to tremble beneath the table. She maintained her composure, meeting each speaker's gaze with quiet dignity. A senior executive from a rival company stepped up. "We didn't just miss an opportunity," she admitted. "We perpetuated a toxic culture that has no place in modern business. Ms. Thornton, your success isn't just a testament to your abilities. It's a wake-up call for our entire industry." As the last speaker finished, Jason leaned close to Alice's ear and whispered softly, "This is the respect you've always deserved." Alice nodded, feeling a complex mixture of relief and validation wash over her. Years of dismissal, mockery, and prejudice were being publicly acknowledged and denounced, yet her hands still trembled under the table, carrying the weight of every past slight and struggle. Alice sat in her sunlit corner office, her fingers hovering over the sleek computer mouse as she scrolled through headline after headline. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow across her desk. "Alice Thornton sparks diversity revolution in business," proclaimed the Wall Street Journal. Similar headlines filled her screen from Forbes, Bloomberg, and countless other publications. A smile spread across her face as she took in the words, her heart swelling with pride. She paused on an article featuring a photo of her speaking at the press conference, standing tall and confident. It was a far cry from the woman who had once hesitated to draw attention to herself at networking events. Her email inbox pinged continuously with notifications. Opening her messages, Alice found dozens of heartfelt notes from women across the country. One particular email caught her eye. It was from a young entrepreneur in Chicago. "Dear Ms. Thornton," it read, "I've been told countless times that I don't fit the image of a CEO, but watching you stand up to industry giants has given me courage. Yesterday, I finally submitted my business proposal. Thank you for showing me that our worth isn't measured by others' prejudices." Alice wiped away a tear as she continued reading similar messages. Each one reinforced that her struggle had meaning beyond personal vindication. In the conference room down the hall, Jason was putting the finishing touches on their newest initiative. The CodeSpark Ethical Enterprise Grant Program would provide substantial funding to businesses that demonstrated commitment to inclusive practices. They had already secured a $50 million fund for the first year. "Alice," Jason called from the doorway, his face beaming with excitement. "The first round of applications is already flooding in. Over 300 submissions in just 2 hours." Alice stood up from her desk and walked over to the wall where they'd hung their first business license. Next to it was a photo of them at that networking event where they'd first met. She was questioning the speaker. He was watching from the crowd. Jason joined her by the wall, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You've changed the industry, Alice," he said softly. "They'll remember this for generations." The morning sun caught the diamond on her wedding ring, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the wall. Alice leaned into Jason's embrace, feeling the warmth of his pride and support. The same unwavering support he'd shown since that very first day. Richard Carver slumped in his leather chair, the glow from multiple screens casting harsh shadows across his face. The financial news played on a loop, each headline more damning than the last. Tech giant falls amid scandal, Carver empire crumbles, systemic discrimination exposed. In her office across town, Alice watched the same coverage, her green eyes fixed on Carver's defeated expression. "He's finished," she said, her tone resolute. The satisfaction she felt wasn't just about winning, it was about justice. Jason stood beside her desk, studying the numbers rolling across the screen. Carver's stock was in free fall, dropping faster than anyone had predicted. Each update brought news of another investor jumping ship, another board member resigning, another lawsuit being filed. The evidence Alice had gathered painted a devastating picture. Dozens of women came forward with stories of discrimination and sabotage. Internal emails revealed systematic efforts to undermine female-led startups. Financial records showed millions spent on smear campaigns targeting successful businesswomen. Alice's throat tightened as she read through the testimonies. So many careers destroyed, so many dreams crushed under the weight of Carver's prejudice. She thought of all the times she'd been dismissed, mocked, underestimated. The memory of those wedding whispers still stung, but now they fueled her resolve. "This isn't just about revenge," she told Jason, her voice steady, despite the emotion building in her chest. "It's about ensuring no one else suffers the way I did." She gestured to the stack of letters on her desk, messages from women sharing their own stories of discrimination, thanking her for taking a stand. Jason watched his wife with pride and admiration. The woman who had once been the target of cruel jokes was now a beacon of hope for others. She'd turned her pain into purpose, her struggles into strength. The news showed Carver being escorted from his building, his usual arrogance replaced by desperate anger. His empire was crumbling, brick by brick, each revelation another blow to the foundation of privilege he'd built his success upon. Alice leaned back in her chair, remembering all the times Carver had tried to intimidate her, to make her feel small. Now he was the one shrinking, his power evaporating in the harsh light of truth. Jason moved closer, taking Alice's hand in his. His touch was warm and reassuring, grounding her in the moment. "You've made it impossible for people like him to thrive," he said, his voice filled with pride and love. The city sprawled beneath them like a tapestry of twinkling lights. each one a tiny star in their own private galaxy. Alice and Jason sat on their penthouse balcony, sharing a quiet moment after the whirlwind of recent events. The gentle evening breeze carried the distant hum of traffic, a reminder of the bustling world below. Jason watched his wife's profile in the soft glow of the city lights, noting how her curly brown hair caught the golden shimmer. His heart ached thinking about everything she'd endured. "I hate that you had to go through so much pain to get here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alice turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting years of battles fought and won. She thought about the whispers at networking events, the snide comments at their wedding, the orchestrated attempts to destroy her career. Each memory still held its sting, but it no longer had the power to wound her. "It hurt, Jason," she admitted, running her fingers along the rim of her tea mug. "But it also made me stronger. I don't regret any of it." Her voice carried the quiet confidence that had drawn Jason to her from the beginning, the same strength that had helped her overcome every obstacle thrown in her path. The city lights cast shifting shadows across their faces as Jason reached for her hand. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, a gesture that had become their silent language of support over the years. "I've always believed in you," he said, his voice steady and sure, even when no one else did. The truth of his words hung in the air between them. From that first day at the networking event, through every cruel comment and calculated attack, Jason had stood firmly by her side. He'd seen past the superficial judgments others made, recognizing the brilliant mind and beautiful soul that made Alice who she was. Alice leaned her head against Jason's shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. Her heart swelled with gratitude and love, knowing that in him she'd found not just a husband, but a true partner who believed in her unconditionally. The city lights continued their dance below, witnesses to a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Cameras flashed and journalists leaned forward in their seats as Alice Thornton took the stage. Her navy blazer complemented her curves perfectly, and her curly brown hair framed her face with its usual elegance. The confidence in her stride spoke volumes about how far she'd come. Jason sat in the front row, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his wife approach the podium. The memory of their first meeting at that networking event felt like a lifetime ago, yet her presence still commanded attention just as it had back then. Alice adjusted the microphone, her green eyes scanning the packed room. "Today, I'm thrilled to announce the launch of the Thornton Initiative," she began, her voice clear and strong. "This mentorship program will provide support, funding, and guidance to underrepresented entrepreneurs who face the same barriers I once did." She paused, letting her words sink in. "No one should face the barriers I did," she continued passionately. "No one should be judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. No one should have their dreams dismissed because they don't fit someone else's narrow view of success." The room hung on her every word. In the audience, Jason noticed several people nodding, some wiping away tears. Alice's story had touched countless lives, and now she was turning that impact into action. As Alice outlined the program's details, social media exploded with support. Comments flooded in from around the world. A young woman in Seattle shared how Alice's journey gave her courage to pitch her tech startup. A plus-sized entrepreneur in Miami described how Alice's success helped her stop apologizing for taking up space in boardrooms. "This program isn't just about funding," Alice explained, her voice growing warmer. "It's about creating a community where every entrepreneur can thrive, regardless of their background, appearance, or circumstances." Jason watched as his wife fielded questions from reporters with grace and precision. Her answers were thoughtful and direct, just like that day years ago when she challenged the speaker at the networking event. But now, instead of being dismissed, she commanded respect. The energy in the room shifted as members of the audience began sharing their own stories. A woman in a wheelchair described how Alice's resilience inspired her to start her own company. A young black tech developer spoke about how Alice's battle against discrimination gave him hope. Alice listened to each story with genuine attention, her eyes bright with emotion. This was more than just a program launch. It was the beginning of a movement. The very people who had once tried to diminish her were now watching as she used her success to lift others up. The applause was thunderous as Alice concluded her presentation. She stood at the podium, taking in the moment, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment wash over her. This was different from the satisfaction of proving her critics wrong or the triumph of exposing Richard Carver's schemes. This was pure, purposeful joy. "This is my purpose," she thought, her heart full as she looked out at the sea of inspired faces. The realization settled over her like a warm embrace. Every obstacle, every cruel comment, every attempt to derail her career had led to this moment, where she could finally help others avoid the same struggles. Jason made his way to the stage as people continued to applaud. His eyes met Alice's, and in that moment, they shared an understanding of just how far they'd come together. The elegant chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Hotel cast a warm glow over the networking event. Business leaders mingled, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum throughout the space. Alice stood near a window, her hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling water, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the glass. Lauren Delaney approached hesitantly, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Her usual confident stride was replaced by something more uncertain, more humble. She wore an expensive black dress, but her typical air of superiority was notably absent. "Alice?" Lauren's voice wavered slightly. "Do you have a moment?" Alice turned, her expression neutral but not unkind. She nodded, gesturing to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Lauren began, wringing her hands together. "But thank you for saving my company. I know you could have let us fail." Alice studied Lauren's face, noting the genuine distress in her eyes. The woman before her was different from the one who had sneered at her wedding, who had whispered cruel words behind her back. "Your methods were harsh," Lauren continued, her voice growing steadier. "But they opened my eyes. I've been implementing those diversity programs you required and—" She paused, taking a deep breath. "The talent we've discovered, the perspectives we've gained, it's transforming our workplace culture." Alice took a sip of her water, listening intently as Lauren spoke about the changes in her company. The statistics, the personal stories, the shifting attitudes among her employees. "You taught me more than I care to admit," Lauren confessed, her cheeks flushing slightly. "About business, about leadership, about my own prejudices." Alice set her glass down on a nearby table. "Change starts with acknowledgement," she replied softly, her voice carrying no trace of bitterness. "I hope you follow through." Lauren nodded earnestly. "I will. I've already started mentoring 3 young women who remind me of you. Brilliant minds that others might overlook. I was wrong about so many things, Alice. So terribly wrong." The moment hung between them, heavy with history and possibility. Then Lauren straightened her shoulders and offered a small, genuine smile before walking away, disappearing into the crowd of networking professionals. Jason appeared at Alice's side, slipping his arm around her waist. He had watched the exchange from across the room, ready to intervene if needed. But Alice had handled it with her characteristic grace. "Even your critics can't help but admire you now," he said, pride evident in his voice as he gazed at his wife. The grand ballroom of the Ritz sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings. Hundreds of guests in formal attire sat at round tables draped in ivory silk, their attention focused on the raised stage where Jason Mallory stood at the podium. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Alice in her emerald evening gown. "Tonight isn't about me," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about Alice Thornton." The spotlight shifted to Alice, who sat at the center table, her cheeks flushing at the sudden attention. Her curly hair was elegantly styled, and diamonds sparkled at her ears. "6 years ago, I was a man with nothing but unpaid bills and a dream," Jason continued, his voice growing stronger. "I went to a networking event feeling lost and defeated. That's where I met Alice." He paused, smiling at the memory. She was questioning a speaker's business strategy with such intelligence and insight that I couldn't help but be drawn to her. The audience listened intently as Jason described their early struggles. We faced mockery, discrimination, and countless attempts to tear us down. But Alice never wavered. She turned every obstacle into an opportunity, every critic into a stepping stone. Tears began to well in Alice's eyes as Jason's voice filled with pride. Alice is the heart of our empire, the reason we're all here today. She taught me what resilience and brilliance look like. She showed me that true strength isn't about power over others. It's about lifting people up and creating positive change. The audience burst into enthusiastic applause. Several people rose to their feet, creating a wave of standing ovations across the ballroom. Alice dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, trying to maintain her composure. My wife, Jason's voice cracked slightly, is the most remarkable person I've ever known. She didn't just build a successful company, she built a movement. She changed an entire industry's perspective on inclusion and diversity. More people stood, the applause growing louder. Alice could see Lauren Delaney in the crowd, clapping earnestly, her own eyes glistening with tears. To Alice Thornton, Jason raised his glass, the woman who proved that brilliance comes in all forms and that kindness can coexist with strength. The room erupted in thunderous applause as Jason stepped down from the stage. Alice rose from her seat, her heart overflowing with emotion. She met him halfway, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking as tears rolled down her cheeks. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees in Central Park, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden bench where Alice and Jason sat. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, reminiscent of that evening years ago when Jason had nervously fumbled with a ring in his pocket. Alice's fingers intertwined with Jason's as she gazed at the horizon. Her navy blazer kept the chill at bay, and her wedding ring caught the fading sunlight. The park was quieter now, with only a few joggers and dog walkers passing by, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. The familiar sounds of the city provided a gentle backdrop: distant traffic, scattered conversations, and the occasional chirp of persistent pigeons. It felt surreal to be back here, where their journey had taken such a significant turn. Do you remember what they said about us at the wedding? Alice asked, her voice soft but steady. She turned to look at Jason, noting how the years had added distinguished touches of gray at his temples. Jason nodded, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. I remember, and I also remember thinking how wrong they were. His eyes held the same warmth they had shown on their wedding day, unchanged by time or circumstance. Alice smiled, the expression reaching her eyes and softening her features. That pain pushed me, Jason. But it's not the pain I'll remember. It's the joy we built. She leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the crisp autumn air. They shared a quiet laugh, the sound carrying across the park like music. The contentment in their hearts was reflected in their relaxed postures and peaceful expressions. They had come so far from those early days of struggle and doubt, and their pride in their accomplishments was well earned. The Code Spark offices buzzed with energy as employees, friends, and family gathered in the expansive main area. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow across the modern space. The sound of glasses clinking and laughter bouncing off the walls created a symphony of joy. Alice stood near the window, wearing a deep purple dress that made her feel confident and beautiful. Her hand rested on Jason's arm as they watched their team mingling. The sight of Lauren chatting amicably with their new diversity coordinator brought a satisfied smile to her face. "Ready for the toast?" Jason whispered, his eyes twinkling with pride. Alice nodded, and Jason gently tapped his glass with a spoon. The room gradually fell silent, all eyes turning to them. The golden evening light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows created a perfect backdrop. "Everyone," Jason began, his voice clear and strong, "thank you for being here tonight." He looked around the room, taking in the familiar faces. "When we started this journey, people told us we couldn't succeed. They said our dreams were too big, our ideas too different." He paused, his eyes finding Alice's. "To resilience, love, and proving everyone wrong. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Alice stepped forward slightly. Her voice carried across the room with quiet confidence. "And to building something that matters." She raised her glass higher. "To every person who dared to believe in themselves when others wouldn't. To every dream that seemed impossible until it wasn't." The room erupted in cheers, glasses raised high. Mark, standing near the back, nodded respectfully. Lauren wiped a tear from her eye. As the celebration continued around them, Jason and Alice slipped away from the crowd. They walked hand in hand through the familiar streets of Manhattan, the evening air crisp and invigorating. The city lights twinkled above them like stars, and the steady hum of traffic created a comfortable backdrop to their thoughts. Alice's heels clicked softly against the sidewalk as they strolled, her free hand holding her coat closed against the evening chill. Jason's thumb traced gentle circles on her hand, a gesture that had become their silent way of saying "I love you" over the years. They passed the park where they'd first dreamed up Code Spark, the coffee shop where they'd spent countless hours planning their future, and the diner where Jason had proposed. Each landmark held a piece of their story, a reminder of how far they'd come. The weight of their accomplishments, the battles they'd won, and the changes they'd sparked in the industry settled around them like a comfortable blanket. There was no need for words. They could feel the rightness of their path in the peaceful silence between them. If you enjoyed the story of Alice Thornton, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.